Hi, welcome back. This is Beersborn. In today's video, we're going to add shadows for our objects. Now, right now, we have a background and we have a camera, but it kind of still has the sense that these characters are just kind of floating against this background, right? Well, we want to add our shadows so it makes it look like the player character, for example, is really standing on this ground. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to make a sprite to represent the shadow. So I'm going to open up Piskel. And I'm going to make just a simple black oval. Now, I'd recommend resizing the canvas. The sprites that I made were 128 by 128. You probably want to do whatever size you made your sprites. So it might be 64, might be 128. And all I'm going to do is use the circle tool to create a black oval that is wider than it is tall. You want to think about, this is going to be a shadow that represents where your character is standing. Now, the size doesn't matter too much. We can always resize it later in Construct. I'm also going to take the paint bucket and fill it in black. And that's it. Just a simple shadow. Now let's export this. And you can export as a GIF or a PNG. It doesn't really matter in this case. Make sure the scale is turned to whatever you've been using. And I'm going to call this shadow. Now let's go into Construct and let's load that shadow sprite in. Now you want to make sure you're on the background layer in this case. And the reason why is because we're going to put the shadow so it's resting on the background, in my case, the dirt texture. So I'm going to put it on the background layer. If your background is locked, which it probably is, you can just unlock it by clicking on that black lock symbol in your layers window. So with the background selected, I'm going to right click. I'm going to insert a new object. I'm going to go down to Sprite. And we have to make a different shadow for each enemy and our main player character. Let's start with our main character. So I'm going to call this, I'm going to call it main character shadow. And click insert. Click anywhere. And let's load the sprite that we just exported. There it is. Now, before I close the animations editor, there's a couple things I recommend doing. First, we want to put the origin point right in the middle of the shadow, because right now my origin point is up here. It just kind of depends on where you put the shadow when you made it in Piskel. What I'm going to do is go to my origin point tool and click right in the center so my origin point's in the middle. And that'll just make it easier to line up the shadow with the bottom of my character's feet. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to crop out the extra space. Now, this is something that I don't recommend doing very often. Whenever you have an object that has animations, so for example, your enemies or your main character, you don't want to use this crop tool because it messes up the animations when you have different image points and stuff. But if it's a simple thing, like just a single frame of a shadow, if you click this button up here that says Crop Transparent Edges, it cuts off all the empty space around it. So let me show you, like right now, my shadow has all this extra empty space, right? But if I crop it, it gets rid of it, and now it's just a shadow, which makes it a little bit easier to work with. You can move it around easier. It doesn't get in the way quite as much. So here's our shadow. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is make some adjustments to this. You know, if I line up this shadow, it's way too big for my character, right? So we can shrink it down. Now, one of the easiest ways to do that is we can just simply grab it from the corner and move it to change the size. Now, I'm holding down the Shift key as I do this. If I hold down the Shift key on my keyboard, it keeps it proportional. If you don't hold down the Shift key, you can make it thicker or taller. You can change the proportions of it. So kind of decide how big you want that shadow to be. I'm going to make mine about that big. That looks good. Now, the other thing I want to do is I want this shadow to not be solid black. I want it to be transparent because a shadow should be kind of see-through, right? It shouldn't look like a black hole. We can make things transparent right in the Construct Layout Editor. If you have your shadow selected, go over to the left side panel. You'll see position, size, angle, and then opacity. What opacity means is how solid something appears. 100% opacity will be completely solid. 0% opacity would be completely see-through. So we want to find a number, a percentage, that we think is a good transparency for the shadow. I'm going to do 20. I think 20 looks pretty good. You can see that now that it's like a little bit more transparent, but still noticeable, right? So it looks a little bit more natural. Good. So that's our shadow. Now, all we have to do is make that shadow track with our player. If I play now and I move, the shadow doesn't move with me, right? So what I'm going to do is go over to my event sheet and I'm going to add an event. I'm going to go to System and I'm going to go to Every Tick. Now, every tick, if you remember from our last video, means that it's constantly updating this action. And the action that we're going to do is for the shadow. And I'm going to go down to, in this case, set position to another object. Now, we haven't looked at this yet, but what it does is you can choose an object. Like in this case, the object I'm going to choose is my main character, and the position of it will constantly update to that object. Now, if you notice, it's kind of hard to see because my sprite is blocking it, but the shadow's actually behind my character, but right in the middle. And the reason for that is because by default, it's going to set it to the position of your main character's origin point. But we want to make it set to our character's feet, right? So what I can do is I can double click on my main character and I'm going to add a new image point. So click on the image point tool over here on the right window. Over here on the left window, I'm going to right click and add a new image point. And let's call this shadow. And I'm going to move that image point right down to my character's feet. Now here's an important step. After you have it in the right position, you have to right click over on that left window and apply it to all animations, because you want your shadow's position to stay consistent, right? And if you don't apply it to all the animations, then the image point might move around or might disappear completely. So right click, apply to all animations. Excellent. The last step for this is going over to the event sheet and making sure that the position is set to the image point that we just created. And if you name it by name, you can put it in quotation marks, shadow. That's the name of the image point we just created. And now if I try it out, it follows with my character, and it gives it more of a sense that my main character is grounded in this world, right? It's actually physically standing on the ground that we see with the texture behind it. Excellent. Now there's one more thing I'm going to add to this, and it's not going to make too much of a difference now, but it's an important idea. If I go over here and I click on my main character, on the left panel, if I scroll down, you'll see after behaviors, there's effects, and then one that says container. What a container does is it groups objects together so that they kind of come as a package. Now, right now there's no container, but I'm going to create a container. And what I'm going to add to the container is the shadow. So now both the main character and the shadow are kind of together. They're linked in a way. And you notice that if I click on one, it highlights the other one in yellow. The reason why that's important is because now if my main character dies, the shadow dies too. If a new main character is created, it creates a shadow with it. These two are grouped together. They like share the same fate. So if one is destroyed, the other one's destroyed with it. Now I can't really show you what that looks like now, but let's add a shadow for one of our enemies, and that'll be a little bit more clear. So let's test it out one last time, make sure it works. You can adjust the opacity or the size if you want to. I think that looks pretty good. So now let's make another shadow. I'm going to again make sure I'm on my background layer. And I'm going to right click and insert a new object. I'm going to go down to the sprite, and this time I'm going to make a shadow from enemy 3. My flying bug is enemy 3, so I'm going to call this enemy 3 shadow. Click anywhere. And then let's go open up, and we can use the same sprite. We can reuse the same shadow because we can always make adjustments to the size and stuff. We don't have to draw and export a new black oval. Again, I'm going to put the origin point right in the center. I'm going to crop out the extra edges. And now I have an enemy shadow too. Now this enemy is flying, so I'm going to have the shadow be pretty small. I'm holding down Shift to keep it proportional. I'm going to set it down below a little ways. And I'm also going to change the transparency to be, again, I think about 20% over on that left window. Now let's go to our event sheet and let's do the same thing we've done here, but for this new shadow for the enemy. So I'm going to add event, go to system, go to every tick, add action. This time I'm going to go to enemy 3 shadow. I'm going to scroll down to set position to another object, click to choose, and I want to set this one to enemy 3. Now I haven't actually made the image point yet, but I know I'm about to. So if you want to do this kind of out of order, while we're here, we could just type in the name of the image point that we're about to make, which is shadow. Now again, we have to use quotation marks because we're using the name. And click done. Now we just have to make sure I go back to the layout, double click on your enemy, and let's create the shadow image point. So I'm on my image point tool. In the left menu, I'm going to right click, add an image point called shadow. I'm going to set it where I want it to be. And for mine, I'm setting it down below, so it looks like he's floating off the ground a little bit. And once you have it set up, you have to right click and apply it to all animations. Good, let's close that and let's test it out. It works. Now, let me show you why it's important for the shadow and the enemy to be in the same container. If I create a new enemy, there's no shadow. If I spawn new enemies, there are no shadows that go along with it. If I destroy this enemy, the shadow just sits there. So without these two being in container, it kind of makes the relationship between the shadow and the enemy a little problematic. So what we can do is make sure that we have enemy 3 selected. I'm going to go down to container. I'm going to click on create. And I'm going to add the enemy 3 shadow into the container with the enemy. Now, if I make new enemies, they automatically come in with their own shadows. And if I destroy an enemy, the shadow will automatically be destroyed alongside. Perfect. Now, what you want to do is do the same thing for your other enemies, right? We have a couple other enemies, and you want to make a shadow for each one. So I'm going to go to like enemy 1, for example, drag that into my layout. I'm going to put in a new object, a sprite called enemy 1 shadow. I'm going to use the exact same sprite that I already exported. Set it up with the origin point right in the middle. I can crop out the extra space. I can size it to be an appropriate size for this enemy. Turn down the opacity on the left menu, and then create an event where every tick, I set the enemy 1 shadow to enemy 1. I set the image point to shadow. Go back over, double click on your enemy, give it a new origin point named shadow. Set it where you want it, apply it to all animations, and then I'm going to make sure that there's a container between my enemy 1 and my enemy 1 shadow. Perfect. And that's it. That's all we have to do. So go ahead and do it for your other enemy as well, and then you're all finished. I'm going to make a group called shadows, and I'll put my events into that group. And that's all there is to it. Thanks for joining, guys. I'll see you next time.